All right then, settle in, grab your coffee or maybe a late night tea. Before we dive into this story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love hearing the names of towns and cities, from little corners of Texas to the quiet coasts of Maine. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and tap that little thumbs up. It really helps me keep sharing these stories from the heart. Now let me tell you about something that happened one quiet morning at the bus stop. Something my son whispered to me that changed how I saw everything. I promise, you won't believe what happened next. It was one of those mornings that feel too still, the kind where the air carries a chill that gets under your sweater, and you know autumn's about to make its full arrival. The neighborhood was quiet, just a few dogs barking somewhere in the distance, and the steady hum of an engine that never seemed to stop from the corner auto shop. The bus stop sat at the end of our street, under an old oak tree that shed its leaves too early every year. My son Daniel was standing beside me, tall now, taller than me by a good few inches, but still with that same half-smile he'd had since he was a boy. He's 16 now, that age where they think they've figured out the world but still want you around, just not too close. I was trying not to stare at him too much. Mothers do that, you know. We memorize every line of their face because we know the time's coming when they'll pull away for good. But something about that morning made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing up the road, as if he was waiting for someone else besides the bus. Or maybe it was just me, overthinking again, like I do when the house feels too quiet. We stood there, side by side, the cold creeping in through the sleeves of my cardigan. I remember brushing away a few leaves from the bench, and Daniel just stood with his hands shoved deep in his hoodie pocket. He looked thoughtful, not the usual impatient teenage kind of thoughtful, but something deeper. "Mom," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was softer than usual, almost like he was testing the word itself. "Yes, sweetheart." I turned, expecting him to ask for money or remind me he needed a ride later. He hesitated, and that's when I knew something was different. His eyes, the same hazel as his father's, darted down the street and then back at me. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, "but I don't know how you'll take it." I laughed a little, one of those nervous laughs that tries to cover up a dozen possibilities. "Well, that depends. If it's about grades, I already saw the report card." He smiled faintly but didn't laugh. "No, it's not about that." For a moment, I thought maybe it was something small. Maybe he'd gotten into trouble, or maybe he liked someone. But his tone, there was weight in it. A kind of grown-up seriousness that didn't belong to the boy I used to tuck in at night. I leaned closer, brushing my hair behind my ear, pretending to fix the strap of my purse, just so I could study his face. "All right then," I said quietly, "tell me." He looked down, his lips pressing together like he was holding back something fragile. The bus wasn't far now. I could hear the rumble of it down the hill, that familiar groan of gears. But in that small pocket of time, everything around us seemed to fade out. The sound, the wind, even the cold. It was just the two of us in that strange suspended moment. "Mom," he said again, and then leaned closer. His voice dropped to a whisper, so soft I could barely catch it. "I saw Dad." The words hit me like a sharp inhale. For a second, I couldn't speak. My husband, Daniel's father, had been gone for 7 years. A car accident on a rainy night, one of those calls you never forget. I blinked at him, confused, my hands instinctively clutching the strap of my purse tighter. "What do you mean you saw Dad?" I asked carefully, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked at me with that teenage defiance, the kind that says you won't understand, but I need to tell you anyway. "Yesterday, near the old bus station downtown, I was with Ryan. We were walking to get fries, and I saw him. He looked right at me." The bus pulled up just then. a loud hiss of brakes breaking whatever spell had been building. Daniel turned, adjusting his backpack, but I was frozen. I wanted to grab his arm, ask 100 questions, demand that he explain. But before I could say anything, he gave me that half-smile again, the one I always thought was his father's gift to him. "I'll tell you later, okay?" he said, stepping toward the bus. "Don't worry, Mom." And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd of kids, the door closing with a mechanical sigh. The bus rumbled away, leaving behind a cloud of diesel and the echo of his words. I saw Dad. I stood there long after the bus had turned the corner. The morning light filtered through the oak leaves, golden and trembling, and I felt that strange mix of disbelief and longing wash over me. It had been years since I'd let myself even imagine his face outside of pictures. But the way Daniel said it, he wasn't joking. When I finally walked home, everything looked different. The same cracked sidewalk, the same little mailbox leaning just a bit to the left, but it all felt heavier, as if the air had thickened around me. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toast. I sat at the table, staring at the framed photo on the counter, the three of us at the beach years ago. Daniel on his father's shoulders, both laughing. I traced my finger along the edge of the frame, thinking of the way grief works, how it hides, how it waits. I didn't know what to make of it then, what Daniel meant, or if it was even possible. But something inside me stirred, a small ache I hadn't felt in years, the kind that whispers maybe there's more to the story. And as strange as it sounds, that whisper was the beginning of everything that came next, the beginning of a truth I wasn't ready to hear, and a moment that would change not just how I saw my son, but how I saw the life we thought we'd lost. Before that morning, I thought I understood what it meant to move on. But I was wrong, because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it comes back in the voice of your own child, standing beside you at a bus stop on a cold autumn morning. And as I sat there in that quiet kitchen, with sunlight creeping across the floor, I knew one thing for certain. I had to find out what my son really saw. I couldn't concentrate on anything that morning. The dishes sat in the sink untouched, the laundry buzzer went off twice, and the coffee had gone cold by the time I realized I'd been sitting in the same chair for nearly an hour. All I could hear in my head was Daniel's voice, that soft, trembling whisper. I saw Dad. I kept trying to reason it out. Maybe he'd seen someone who looked like his father. That happens, doesn't it? We all see faces in crowds that remind us of people we've lost. I even laughed at myself for a moment, a small nervous laugh that didn't last long. But deep down, something told me it wasn't that simple. Daniel wasn't the kind of boy to imagine things. He noticed details, small ones, the kind of things people miss, a watch, a certain walk, the way someone tilts their head when they're listening. If he said he saw his father, he believed it. I waited for him to come home from school all day. The hours stretched, the house too quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Around 3:30, I set out a plate of cookies like I used to when he was younger, not because I thought he'd eat them, but because it made me feel like a mother again, not some anxious woman chasing ghosts. When he walked through the door, I could tell right away that he hadn't forgotten what he'd said. He hesitated, one foot inside, backpack half off his shoulder. His eyes met mine, cautious, testing the waters. "You didn't forget," I said quietly. He shook his head. "No. Did you think I would?" I smiled, even though my throat was tight. "Sit down, honey. Tell me everything." He dropped his backpack by the door and sat across from me, his fingers tracing the pattern on the tablecloth like he needed something solid to hold on to. "It was yesterday," he began. "After school, Ryan and I went downtown. You know that place by the old station where they're rebuilding the diner? We were cutting through the lot, and I saw a man standing by the payphone. He was wearing a dark coat. Dad's kind, the wool one he used to wear when it rained. I remembered that coat instantly. Navy blue with those big brown buttons and a tear at the right pocket he never bothered to fix. I'd donated it years ago. Daniel continued, his voice quieter now. He looked just like him, Mom. The same way he stood, the way he rubbed the back of his neck. I called out. I said, "Dad?" And he turned around. He looked right at me. He swallowed hard, his fingers still tracing. And then he walked away. I felt my chest tighten, as if all the air in the room had been sucked out. "Did you follow him?" He shook his head. "No." Ryan thought I was imagining it, said I was seeing things, but I swear it was him. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he'd seen someone else, that grief can play tricks on you even when you think you've moved on. But the way he looked at me, so certain, so vulnerable, made the words stick in my throat. "Can you take me there tomorrow?" I asked finally. He hesitated. "You believe me?" "I don't know," I said softly, "but I believe you believe it, and that's enough." That night, after Daniel went to bed, I sat by the window with the old photo album open on my lap. I hadn't done that in years. There he was, my husband, Mark, smiling, his arm around me, Daniel perched on his shoulders at the fair. He'd been 38 when he died. Too young, too full of life. I remember how the rain had come down that night, how the officer's hat dripped water onto our porch when he told me. And now my son was telling me he'd seen him alive. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound in the house, the creak of the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, made me flinch. Around midnight, I finally gave up trying and made myself another cup of tea. The moonlight spilled across the counter, soft and silver, and I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older than I felt, but there was something else in my eyes too, something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. The next afternoon, Daniel and I drove downtown. It felt strange, being in that part of the city again. The old bus station stood like a relic from another life, cracked pavement, faded signs, pigeons perched along the rusted roof beams. They were rebuilding part of it, sure, but the air still carried that smell of oil and dust. "That's where I saw him," Daniel said, pointing toward a row of boarded-up shops beside the lot. We parked nearby and walked across the street. The sound of cars echoed off the concrete walls, a kind of low hum that made everything feel distant. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting. But there was no one, just the wind, rustling papers against the curb. "Maybe he'll come back," Daniel said. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. We stood there for a while, neither of us speaking, just waiting. After a few minutes, an older man came out of one of the buildings. He wore a work vest and carried a clipboard. Daniel's eyes followed him, hopeful, but it wasn't him. Then, just as we were about to leave, I noticed something on the wall behind the payphone. Faded, but still there, a message scrawled in blue chalk. At first, I thought it was just graffiti, but when I leaned closer, I froze. It said, "Tell her I'm sorry." I turned to Daniel. "Did you see this before?" He shook his head, wide-eyed. "No. Mom, do you think?" I didn't answer. My heart was pounding too hard. Tell her I'm sorry. It could have been anyone, of course. Just words on a wall. But something about it, the way it was written, the slant of the letters, looked painfully familiar. When Mark used to leave me little notes, on the fridge, in my purse, even once on the bathroom mirror, he always wrote the same way, tilted with that little flourish at the end of his eyes. I reached out and touched the words, my fingers brushing against the chalk. It smudged slightly under my skin. "Mom?" Daniel's voice was small, uncertain. "Let's go," I said quietly. "It's getting late." We didn't talk much on the drive home. The city lights passed in blurs, and I caught Daniel watching me from the corner of his eye, waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't. Not yet. That night, I lay awake, replaying it all. The whisper, the wall, the memory of a man who should have been gone, but suddenly felt closer than ever. And somewhere deep inside, beyond reason or logic, a thought began to form. Quiet, impossible, but persistent. What if he never really died? The next morning came gray and heavy, the kind of morning that doesn't seem to wake up no matter how long the sun's been up. The air smelled like rain, even though the sky hadn't broken yet. I made coffee and stared out the kitchen window, watching the condensation trail down the glass. My mind was still caught on that blue chalk message from the day before. Tell her I'm sorry. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's handwriting, heard his laugh, remembered that last morning before the accident, how he'd kissed the top of my head and said, "Don't wait up, honorable." I never thought those would be the last words he'd ever say to me. But now, after all these years, my son was telling me he'd seen him alive, and the universe was taunting me with a note scrawled on a wall. When Daniel came downstairs, he was quieter than usual. He poured himself a bowl of cereal, but he barely touched it. We didn't need to say what we were both thinking. "Mom," he said finally, his spoon clinking against the bowl, "do you think he might have faked it? Like maybe he didn't die?" The question hit like a punch I didn't see coming. "That's not something people just do, Daniel," I said, a little sharper than I meant to. "He wouldn't have left us. You know that." He didn't argue, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, and it wasn't the kind of doubt I could erase with motherly reassurance. He was 16, caught between believing the world still had logic and learning that sometimes it doesn't. After he left for school, I sat with my coffee, turning the thought over and over. What if he had survived? What if something had happened that night that none of us knew about? I tried to stop myself, to be reasonable, grounded, but something about that chalk, those slanted letters, wouldn't let go. Around noon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the police station. The officer at the front desk looked younger than Daniel. His nameplate read Che Horton, and he had that polite, guarded expression people wear when they're about to hear something they won't believe. "I need to ask about a case," I said, sliding my ID across the counter. "From 7 years ago, my husband's car accident." He nodded, tapping on the keyboard. "Name?" "Mark Bennett." He typed for a moment, then looked up. "Records like that are archived, ma'am. You'd have to file a request." "I understand," I said, leaning forward. "But could you just check something for me? Just the location." "Where they said the accident happened." He hesitated, then turned back to the screen. "Looks like Route 14, near the old bridge. Car went off the shoulder. Recovered body was identified at the scene." "Who identified it?" I asked. He scrolled again. "It says, visual confirmation by a coworker, Richard Hale." I blinked. Richard Hale. I hadn't heard that name in years. He worked with Mark at the construction company. They'd been close. After the funeral, Richard stopped visiting, stopped calling. I figured grief got the better of him too. Was the body, was it ever confirmed with dental records or anything? The officer frowned slightly. "I'm not seeing that in the file, ma'am. Maybe it's in the archived documents. You'd need to submit a formal request to access them." I thanked him, though my legs felt unsteady. As I walked back to the car, the rain finally started, soft at first, then steady. It drummed against the windshield as I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding with a rhythm that matched the rain. If Richard had been the one to identify the body, what if he'd been wrong? Or worse, what if he hadn't been wrong at all, but had helped Mark disappear? The thought chilled me more than the rain ever could. That night, after Daniel went to bed, I found Richard's old number in one of Mark's address books. I doubted it would still work, but I dialed it anyway. To my surprise, someone answered. "Hello." The voice was gravelly, older now, but unmistakable. "Richard? It's Elaine. Elaine Bennett." There was a pause on the other end, a long, heavy silence. "Elaine," he said finally, his tone low. "It's been a long time." "I know," I said softly. "I just need to ask you something. About that night. The accident." He sighed, and for a moment I heard something in his voice, something between regret and fear. "Elaine, it's been 7 years." "Why now?" "Because my son says he saw him. Mark. Downtown. Yesterday." The silence that followed was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled slightly. "You shouldn't be calling me about this." "Please, Richard, just tell me the truth." He hesitated again, and I could almost hear him weighing his words. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people make choices we don't understand, and sometimes the truth doesn't bring peace. It brings more pain." "Are you saying he's alive?" I demanded. But he didn't answer that. All he said was, "Don't go back to that bus station. Let it be, Elaine, for your sake and for Daniel's." Then he hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. His words didn't sound like denial. They sounded like warning. Sleep was impossible after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, half hidden in the rain, turning away from me just as Daniel described. The memory of him, the smell of his cologne, the warmth of his hands, all of it came flooding back until I felt dizzy from it. By morning, I'd made up my mind. If Mark was alive, I was going to find him. Not because I needed closure, but because I couldn't bear the thought that my son might be right, and that I'd spent 7 years mourning a man who was still walking this earth somewhere, leaving messages in chalk and watching from shadows. So when Daniel came down for breakfast, I was already dressed, car keys in hand. "Where are you going?" he asked, surprised. "To see someone," I said, "and you're coming with me." He frowned. "Who?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked him in the eye and said, "We're going to find your father." He stared at me, caught between fear and hope. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay, Mom, let's do it." And that's how it began, the day everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my husband started to unravel one truth at a time. The drive out of town felt different that day. The roads I'd driven for years suddenly felt unfamiliar, like the landscape itself had been rearranged overnight. The gray sky hung low, pressing down on the hills in a quiet, heavy way. Daniel sat beside me, earbuds dangling from his lap, but no music playing. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. I had called Richard again that morning. He hadn't answered, but I left a message, not angry, not pleading, just tired. "You owe me the truth," I said into the receiver. "Please." An hour later, he called back. His voice was rough, but softer this time. "Meet me by the lake," he said. "The old cabin. You remember it." I did. Mark had helped Richard build that cabin when we were first married. We used to go there on weekends before Daniel was born. Just the 3 of us sometimes, fishing, barbecuing, pretending life would always stay that simple. I didn't tell Daniel much on the drive, just that we were meeting someone who might know something. The closer we got, the more the past pressed in. The lake came into view, still and glassy, the trees around it a mixture of deep green and rusted gold. Time hadn't touched it much. The cabin still stood on the far side, the wood darker now, the porch sagging slightly, but it was there. When we pulled up, Richard was waiting. He looked older than I remembered, gray hair under a faded cap, his face worn and tired, like he'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. He didn't smile when he saw us. He just nodded and motioned for us to follow him inside. The cabin smelled of dust and cedar. A kettle sat on the stove, not yet boiling. Daniel hovered near the door, cautious. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly. Richard gave a faint nod, his eyes flicking between us. "You look just like him," he said to Daniel, and something in his voice cracked a little. I folded my arms. "Tell me the truth, Richard. Please. Did Mark survive?" He didn't answer right away. He took off his cap, rubbed the back of his neck, and stared out the window toward the lake. "I told myself I'd never talk about that night again," he said finally. "But you deserve to know." He turned back toward me, his eyes glassy. "The night of the accident. It wasn't an accident. Mark had been planning to leave." I felt my breath catch. "What?" Richard sighed. "He got mixed up in something. A business deal gone wrong. He didn't tell you because he thought he could fix it before it got bad. But by the time he realized what he'd gotten into, it was too late. He was scared, Elaine. Not just for himself, for you and the boy." I shook my head slowly. "That doesn't make sense. He loved us. He wouldn't just disappear." "He didn't want to," Richard said quietly. "But he thought it was the only way to keep you safe. That night, I went to meet him. We staged the wreck, burned the car, left someone else's body in it. A drifter who didn't have anyone to miss him. Mark made me promise to say it was him. He was gone before the flames even caught." The room spun for a moment. I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. My pulse roared in my ears. "You're telling me my husband faked his own death? That you helped him?" Richard's eyes were full of guilt. He said it was temporary. He said once it was safe, he'd come back. But then he didn't. And I never heard from him again. Until last month. Daniel stepped forward. "What do you mean, last month?" Richard hesitated. He called me. Said he'd been watching. That he wanted to make things right. I didn't believe him until I saw him myself, near that bus station. He looked rough, older, tired. But it was him. He said he left you a message. The chalk words, "Tell her I'm sorry." I could barely breathe. Where is he now? Richard looked at me for a long time before answering. "He's been staying near the river on the east side. There's a shelter there, behind the old mill. He said he'd be there until he figured out what to do next." I didn't wait another second. The drive to the east side was silent. My hands trembled on the wheel. My heart caught somewhere between anger and hope. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Answers, maybe. Closure. Or just to see his face again, one last time. The shelter was easy to miss. A brick building behind a chain-link fence, half hidden by overgrown weeds. A man outside pointed when I showed him the photo. "Yeah," he said. "He comes by mornings. Sits near the riverbank, just past the bridge." Daniel and I walked that way together. The river moved slow and wide, its surface reflecting the dull gray sky. And then I saw him. He was sitting on an old bench, shoulders slumped, hands clasped together. His hair was thinner, streaked with gray. His beard was short, uneven. But it was him. Even from a distance, I knew. For a moment, I couldn't move. 7 years of grief and confusion melted into one sharp, overwhelming rush of emotion. Daniel looked at me, unsure, waiting for me to lead. I took a step forward, then another. "Mark?" My voice broke on his name. He turned, startled. His eyes widened, and for a second, he didn't breathe either. Then he stood, slowly, like a man unsure if he was dreaming. "Elaine?" We just stood there, facing each other, the sound of the river filling the space between us. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask why. But all that came out was a trembling whisper. "Why did you do it?" He ran a hand through his hair, his voice raw. I thought I was protecting you. I got into debt. People who didn't forgive easily. They threatened to come after you, after Daniel. I didn't see another way. I shook my head, tears spilling before I could stop them. You let us mourn you. You let your son grow up thinking you were gone. Do you know what that did to us? He looked down, shame tightening his features. Every day,